Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Capital City Baptist Church. Our reading today is found in the book of Psalms 20, verse 7, which reads like this: Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Many years ago, when I read about the story of how the promised land was conquered by Joshua and his army, I remember that the first attempt at bringing down not Jericho, but the small city of Ai, was met with utter failure for two reasons. First, after having secured their first victory over Jericho, which incidentally was a fortified and mighty city, Joshua and his counselors forgot that their victory was not due to themselves. Oh, I'm sure they had trained for battle, and I'm also sure they had some weapons to go around for the battle. But ultimately, their winning the battle had everything to do with the commander in chief, namely the Lord, and nothing to do with the armies of Israel. Now, before you get the wrong idea, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination dumping on the armies of Israel. Again, I do believe that they had trained hard for battle, as best as they could. They had gathered whatever clubs, knives, swords, and armor they could muster to war against the Canaanites. But with all the training and all the gathering of armor and weaponry, they still were no match for the armies of Jericho. The armies of Jericho were well equipped to fend off any attack from a formidable enemy. They had training and knew their terrain like no other. Plus, they had a big wall that separated themselves from any invading armies. Israel was not the first to attempt an attack on Jericho, and the armies of Jericho were only too well prepared to squash anyone who would dare to attack them. Now, I am sure, as well-trained defenders, Jericho took all threats seriously. But taking one look at the armies of Israel was enough to make even a gambler bet on the defenders rather than the invaders. And you know what? That was the whole point. This was to be a totally unconventional battle. Israel was to take absolutely no credit for what they were about to accomplish. This was God handing the Canaanites to Israel on a silver platter, so to speak, with little to no effort of Israel's part. Now, yes, it's true, they were to finish off the Canaanites completely. But the main battle would be fought by the Lord himself, and fought it himself he did. The enemy soldiers of Jericho fell or were crushed to their death by God's mighty earthquake and the fall of the walls of Jericho. Israel only had to swoop in and annihilate the survivors of the devastating earthquake. Nevertheless, in all the excitement and celebration, two failures happened. First, again, Israel, in essence, failed to give God glory for the victory handed to them. Yes, they did according to what the Lord told them to do. But I am sure there were some, or perhaps many, who likely grumbled at not getting their share of the spoils of war. I'm sure they felt that killing off the livestock was a total waste, and certainly sparing some of the choice young men and women of the Canaanites as slaves would not have hurt. But they forgot that this victory was the Lord's, not theirs. And that, dear listener, is the danger when God's people do not give glory to the Lord for all that he does in us and through us. Accomplishments in the Lord should never be about us. Instead, they should always be about him. But there was a second failure. The second failure was simply not having enough insight to ensure that not one soldier violated the prime directive, which was to abstain from touching any of the accursed stuff. All costly material was to go to the Lord, no exceptions. Tragically, we understand that Achan had other plans. He too felt probably that destroying everything was a waste, and that not everything, or that not having some of the spoil was actually infringing on his right to compensation for whatever effort he might have expended on the campaign to bring Jericho down. And you have to wonder, with so many people around, how was it that Achan managed to acquire the spoils that he hid? The Bible tells us that the Lord's anger burned against the Israelites. But why the Israelites? Well, I imagine that it is because whenever someone does something wrong, it usually doesn't happen without others knowing something. The Bible clearly tells us that the sons, notice plural, of Israel acted unfaithfully and violated their obligation in regard to the things that were under the ban. Although it surely was Achan who ultimately committed the act of disobedience, it is very unlikely that he was the sole person who knew what he had done. It is likely that many desired to do the exact same thing that Achan did. They just weren't slick enough. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe they made a deal with Achan. Save a couple of those shekels for me, all right? I don't know. Whatever the case is, brothers and sisters, the Lord's anger was burning against all of Israel, and he allowed them to suffer an embarrassing and painful deceit for their arrogance and silent defiance to his orders. The Bible states that after Achan's sin was brought to light, he and his family suffered a horrific execution. The Bible tells us that he and his whole family, were stoned. And not just his family, everything he possessed, including his animals. His defiance, or his, if you will, his punishment was to be a warning to the rest of Israel that God would not stand for their defiance, blatant or quiet. And you're saying, okay, what does all this have to do with the verse that we started with? Well, remember what it stated, that some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God? What did Israel trust in that handed them a most embarrassing defeat and the loss of some very good men of valor? Themselves. That's it. What did Israel do to incur the anger of the Lord? Disobedience. Whether passive or aggressive, it doesn't make any difference. It is rejecting the sovereignty of God and believing instead that we can do as we please regardless of what God's word says. Brothers and sisters, when we truly trust in the Lord and give him the glory he is due, there is no room in our hearts of silent defiance or desire to share in the spoil that doesn't belong to us. Instead, we recognize that in and of ourselves, we can do absolutely nothing. We allow him, instead, to be lifted up, not ourselves. We submit to his authority instead of placing ourselves in his rightful place. When we trust in our strengths, we're actually denying the Lord and his sovereignty over us. That is why we cannot accept the world's philosophies of believing in ourselves and we can do anything we put our minds to. And so, instead, brothers and sisters, let us never forget that God is sovereign and we are not. We do not trust in ourselves. Remember, we are dead to self. Instead, we trust in him always, not in horses, not in chariots, but in the name of the Lord our God until he comes. May God bless you. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday if the Lord wills.